This is For Keeps With You. Baxter Boys, Book 5. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by Jay Dyess. Episode 2, Chapters 5 through 7. Chapter 5. Roland stared at Dusty. This was his opening. He could tell her about the long process and encourage her to stick with it. He'd never hesitated before. Why was he hesitating now? He shoved whatever feeling it was aside and straightened off the desk. "That's where you're wrong." He moved around the side of the desk. "Do you have a weak stomach?" Her brows drew down into a V. "Huh?" He reached down for the bottom of his pant leg. "I showed this to one woman, and she threw up on me." He turned his head and looked up at her with one eye. "I'm not making that up." "Showed her what?" Dusty asked, her brows still drawn. He pulled his pant leg up. The pink and white deformed skin slowly came into view. He set his foot on the desk. "This," he lifted a shoulder, "this is actually my good leg." "You're kidding," Dusty gasped, throwing a hand over her mouth. "I'm sorry," she said between her fingers. "It's fine. You should hear the kids' reactions." Her eyes snapped to his. "You tell them?" "If I think they need to hear it." Her hand dropped back to her lap. "So I need to hear it." "You said I didn't understand." He nodded at his leg. Even now he could hardly believe that it belonged to him. It didn't look like his. "I think I do." Her fingers twisted in her ponytail, and she bit her lip as her eyes slid slowly back to his leg. She swallowed. "I guess you must." "Yeah." He dropped his leg down. "You want to see the other one?" Her eyes flew to his. It was the first time since they'd met that she seemed uncertain. She didn't wear the emotion well. "Never mind." He put his other leg up and drew up his pant leg. The skin on this leg was even more deformed. It actually turned his stomach. "Can't they do surgery, like plastic surgery, to fix that?" she asked. He hated the hesitation in her voice. "They could. They wanted to, actually. But I'd already spent months in the hospital. Skin grafts, bandage changes, infections, constant pain. I was ready to walk out and never walk into another hospital again." "I bet." Now compassion filled her eyes, and he didn't like that any better. He shoved his pant leg down and dropped his foot. "How old were you?" she asked. "I was a second-year medical student." Normally, he stopped the questions right here, but she was faster than his normal patience. "You were going to be a doctor." "Yeah." He shifted, leaning again on the desk, his arms crossed over his chest. "A hospital's a bad place for a doctor to hate." He shrugged like it didn't matter. "By the time I was done with therapy, I had found a new calling." He met her eyes, keeping any emotional pain wiped clean from his face. "People seem to think I'm good at it." "I see why." She nodded. Her posture straightened and her chin lifted. "It worked. Anything boys can do, girls can do better." She grinned with a challenge. "You did it. I can do it better." He laughed. "I never understood the competition between the sexes, but if that's what motivates you, lap it up." "You don't compete with your girlfriend?" His face fell. Technically, he supposed, he'd won because she'd died. But no, he'd never considered it a competition. even if she was a med student too. One from a family of means who'd thought it a good idea to let their beautiful, gregarious daughter get her pilot's license. Stupid parents. No, he gave her honesty. I always thought of us as a team with different strengths that complemented each other. He closed his mouth. If he started to think about Janice, the pain he kept locked away might escape. Past tense? She asked softly. She died. He stood abruptly. I bet your friend is waiting on you. Which one is it today? Harris or Kelly, Tuff's wife? Dusty took the hint, thankfully, and struggled out of the chair. Riley is picking me up. She'll be new. You have a lot of friends. He walked to the door and put his hand on the knob. Dusty nodded. I guess you could have given me a lecture on counting my blessings. Would that have been effective? Because I do have that one in my repertoire. Maybe. I guess you could try it out on me next week. Okay, I'll keep that in mind. If your doctor's appointment doesn't go well on Monday, I'll brush it off and whip it out. She laughed. Oh, it's going to go well. If he knows what's good for him, he's going to tell me I can drive and I can lose at least one of these braces. Good luck with that. He bet the doctor actually would allow her to take her brace off and drive. Maybe not with a regular patient, but Dusty was anything but regular. He opened the door, and she limped out ahead of him. A very pregnant woman with shoulder-length brown hair stood by the door. Her face brightened, and she smiled at Dusty. I'll be right over, he said as Dusty limped away. He wrote his notes and printed off her instruction sheet. Roland, this is Riley Baxter. Looks like Riley and a +1. He shook her hand and met her direct gaze. She laughed. It feels like I'm carrying a +13, but the doctor assures me it's only 1. Just big, like his dad. And ready to show up any day, Dusty said with a grin. That's what they said at my appointment today. She sighed with a hand on her large belly. I'm ready. Anything over 65 degrees is too hot when you're pregnant, and it's June. It's time. Wait until you get me home first, please. Dusty smiled, but there was a definite shadow of fear in her eyes. Dusty, the doctor said you weren't allowed to drive, but there are no restrictions on your chart about delivering babies. Roland couldn't resist teasing her. I would be helpless in that situation, I promise, she said with a shudder. You're not feeling any contractions, are you? Riley shook her head. Unfortunately, no. You need to tell him to wait until after tomorrow. It would be awkward to have to cancel your baby shower because he decided to show up. Sorry, but if I have to choose between seeing my little guy and having the baby shower, I'm going for my kid. I get it. He can come any time after 3. They linked arms, and Dusty turned to wave. See you Monday, Roland said, trying not to wonder why he felt this odd sense of sadness at not seeing her for 2 days. Chapter 6. Saturday afternoon, Roland pulled his car into the garage. He liked coming to Tuff Baxter's garage, not only because it wasn't too far from where he lived, just a few minutes across town, but also because Tuff was an easygoing guy who was just as likely to hand him a wrench and show him how to do something as he was to do it for him. To someone like him, who had more book knowledge than actual hands-on knowledge, it was a nice change. No one in his family worked a blue-collar job. His dad was a lawyer, his mother an obstetrician, both practicing in Philadelphia. His brother was on the board of some company in Texas. Roland wasn't sure exactly what he did, but he was sure it didn't involve getting his hands any dirtier than a round of golf required. At Tufts, there were also the old men who were always arguing in the corner. It gave the place character. All around, Tufts' garage was a great place to spend a Saturday. Roland wore old clothes and showed up at 12 on the dot. Although when he'd called, Tuff had said, around lunch. Tuff was pretty relaxed. "That's good," Tuff said as Roland inched his car forward. "We'll have it on the lift." "Okay." Roland slid his window up before getting out. When he first started coming, Tuff didn't talk as much. Since he'd gotten married, he definitely smiled more. Sentences seemed to come a little easier for him, too. A good woman could have that effect on a man. He shoved that thought aside before he started thinking about Janice again. "How have you been, Tuff?" Roland held out his hand. Tuff grabbed it with his calloused one and pumped. "Busy." "It's that time of year. School's letting out, and everyone's getting ready to go on vacation." One side of Tuff's mouth curved up. "Good for business." "You and me both. Lots of sports injuries in the summer." "Wow, that's sad." Turbo, Tuff's brother, came over, holding a red-haired toddler in one arm and a dark-haired toddler in another. Deshaun, his oldest son, trailed behind. "It must be awful to make your living off the misfortune of others." Turbo was never serious. In all the time Roland had been at the garage, Turbo was perpetually happy. He took the statement like the joke it was. "Kind of like a tow truck driver, huh?" Turbo laughed. The kids in his arms watched his face and smiled when he did. "We've got a smart aleck on our hands." "Takes one to know one," one of the old men at the checkerboard shouted across the garage. "It never fails to amaze me how good their hearing is when I'm not trying to talk to them," Turbo said with a head shake. "I heard that," the same white-haired guy shouted. Tuff laughed. "You know where the wrenches are. I'll get a filter." Turbo shifted the kids in his arms. "Seriously? This is the only shop I know where people have to do the work themselves." He looked at Roland. "He'll probably still charge you." "Double rate when I do the work myself," Roland said with a straight face. "Triple if he tries to give me advice while he's doing it," Tuff said with the same serious look. Turbo grinned. "Well, I'd love to help, but I'm busy." He jiggled the kids in his arms. "I'm heading over to Kelly's Children's Center to play for a while." He cleared his throat. To let the kids play for a while." Roland laughed at the idea of Turbo at the Children's Center that shared the building with Tuff's garage. "The truth comes out first, huh?" "There's nothing wrong with having fun at any age," Turbo said over his shoulder as he walked to Tuff's office. The buildings connected through the back office, although Roland had only seen family using the connecting doors. "At least Kelly can help keep an eye on Turbo. No telling what he'll get into over there," Roland commented as Tuff handed him the box with the filter in it. "Kelly's at a baby shower," Tuff snorted, "along with Turbo's wife and all the other ladies in the family." "Oh." Roland set the box aside. He'd never really thought much about babies. Even when Janice and he were together, they'd kind of had an understanding that babies would be far in the future after both of them had completed medical school and residencies. His brother was married, and they weren't planning on having children. Having hit 30 with no kids and no wife, Roland figured he probably would never have any. He really hadn't recovered from losing Janice. He definitely wasn't interested in going through that again. But a long-haired blonde popped into his mind as he twisted the filter wrench. Dusty had impressed him with her drive and determination. She got knocked down but wasn't afraid to get back up and keep trying. Although Dusty was going to have to find something else to do other than motocross racing. Maybe the doctor would break the news to her at her appointment on Monday. Several hours later, his oil was changed, and he stood around drinking coffee and talking shop with the old men, Tuff and Turbo. The other Baxter brothers, Ben and Torque, had arrived in the early afternoon. Torque had his kids in tow. Roland remembered the shower was for Ben's wife, Riley, who had picked Dusty up from therapy. "When was her due date again?" Torque asked, taking a sip of his coffee and shaking his head when one of his preschooler twins asked to have a sip. "Tomorrow," Ben said. He was the only one who didn't have a child in his arms. Every other time Roland had met Ben, he'd seemed pretty calm, but today he couldn't stop pacing. "I'm betting you're going to get a call to meet her at the hospital," Turbo said with a smirk. Roland would bet on that, too. When she'd picked Dusty up, he just hoped she made it out of the therapy center before labor started. "Shut up, Turbo," Ben said, his calm tone belying his words and the twitching of his leg. Torque grinned. "There's nothing to it, Ben. You watch your wife suffer in agony for 12 to 24 hours, then she can't stop smiling, and you never sleep again. Easy as a medieval torture chamber." "We could have chosen a torture chamber?" Turbo acted surprised. "I'd have done that, in a heartbeat." Ben had quit trying to pretend he wasn't pacing. He poured what had to be his 7th cup of coffee. "You guys aren't making him feel any better," Roland felt compelled to say. "There's nothing to feel better about," the old man with the white hair, Mr. Siegel, said. "It hurts, and no amount of Twinkies make it better," Turbo said with a dramatic shudder. "You must be talking about labor again." Harris, Turbo's wife, walked in the garage door. "Busted," Torque said under his breath. Roland laughed. He saw his brother every other Christmas. They might spend a few minutes talking about the stock market. It wasn't fun, and he couldn't wait to leave. He'd much rather hang out in the garage with the Baxter brothers. But if the wives were home, that was his cue to go. "I threw my check on your desk," he said to Tuff as a blonde and a very similar-looking brunette walked in. He wasn't sure, and he couldn't remember their names, but he thought those were the Baxter sisters. Twins, if he recalled correctly. Tuff nodded. "Thanks." Roland threw his hand up as he walked away. "See you guys in a few months." The brothers called out farewells. He nodded at the twins and Harris and Cassidy and Kelly. He would have nodded a greeting at Riley, but Ben had hurried to her and was hovering over her in a way that Roland, even with his limited experience with pregnant women, could tell was guaranteed to annoy her. He laughed to himself and shut the door behind him, digging in his pocket for the keys to his car, which they'd parked along the street to get it out of the way. A blonde head in the back of one of the cars caught his eye. At first, he assumed he was imagining things. For some reason, he seemed to see blonde heads everywhere lately. But he slowed down anyway. In the back of his mind, ever since he heard about the shower, he'd wondered if he'd see Dusty. She had her braced leg propped along the back seat. Her head leaned back against the back window, and her eyes were closed. Maybe he should have walked by, but he tapped on the window. She jerked up, wincing. Immediately, concern tightened his chest. Her eyes widened when she saw him. She twisted and put her finger up to put the window down. "Hey," he said. "Riley made it through the shower without anyone having to practice their baby-delivering skills?" Dusty smiled, which was what he was going for. "Yeah, much to everyone's relief. Mine most of all." "Yeah, I can see you taking a bike apart and putting it back together blindfolded, but I have a hard time picturing you delivering a baby." She smiled, but it was pinched. His healthcare instincts kicked in. "You're hurting." He found with people like Dusty, it was better to state the obvious, because she'd just deny it if he asked. She sighed. "My back." A jolt of concern went through him. Of all of her injuries, her back was the one that could have done the most damage. "I've been sitting too long, but," she laughed, "it hurts to walk. It hurts to sit. It hurts to stand on my head." She swallowed. "I can't really do anything without pain." "Someone is coming to take you home?" He wasn't sure whose car she was sitting in. "I told them to take their time. Hanging out at the garage is downtime combined with family time for them, and I didn't want to rush them." "I'll take you home." Even as the words were coming out of his mouth, he knew he was blurring the line between therapist and patient. He already thought of Dusty way more than his other clients, and he'd warned himself repeatedly that he needed to be careful. She looked down, seeming to think about it. He half hoped she'd say no. But there was no denying the excitement that leaped in his soul when she said, "Okay." "Let me run in and tell them. I'll be back out in a second to give you a hand." Her head snapped up, and he held up his hand. I know. You can do it yourself. I'm your therapist, remember?" He felt like he needed the reminder. "But let me help you because I want to, and it makes me feel good." Her lips curved up, and she rolled her eyes. "Fine." He hurried in. The ladies wanted to come out and talk to her, but he assured them she was fine, and since they all knew him as Dusty's therapist, he got the impression they figured she'd be in good hands. Dusty was out of the car when he returned. "I thought you said I could help." She lifted a slim shoulder. "You weren't here." "Here." He held out his arm. "Hold on to me and try to keep from putting all your weight on your knee." Her hand came up and squeezed his biceps. He tried to tell himself that didn't give him a thrill, but it was an outright lie. Pointing them in the direction of his car, he started walking, letting her set the pace. "I assume your ribs didn't hurt?" He remembered reading on her chart that they'd been bruised. Sometimes ribs were the slowest thing to heal. "My whole body feels sore. I overdid it with the shower." She gave him a sideways look. "I tried to help decorate." He shook his head. "The therapist in me wants to lecture you." "Ignore him." "I think that's my feminine side." "So," she said slowly, "as a therapist, you identify with the female pronouns?" He laughed outright, but stopped abruptly when he glanced over and she wasn't smiling. "Male pronouns. Every day." His grin teased a smile out of her. They stopped at the side of his car. "Do you need to sit in the back?" he asked. "If I take my brace off, I can sit in the front." "The contents of your chart are confidential, but I think you know the doctor told you to wear it all the time except to shower." She sighed, a deep sigh that said just how sick of the brace she was. "You know, if you didn't do dangerous things like race motocross, you wouldn't be wearing a brace right now." "I'm just as likely to have a car accident and be in worse shape," she replied, stubbornly in his opinion. It fascinated him how someone so small could have so much determination. He opened the back door. "I can fold myself in, but I look like a groundhog squeezing into a mouse hole. Maybe you could pretend there's an elephant standing in the middle of the street?" "What, and miss the show?" He teased, then turned his back out of respect for her pride. She had a lot of it. Her home was only 20 minutes from Tuff's shop, in the wealthy section of town, and they spent most of the ride in silence between her giving him directions. He pulled up the long, curving drive. A large brick two-story home sat majestically at the top. A massive, shiny, dark blue and silver motorhome, with a BMW SUV attached to it, was parked beside the garage. "My parents are home," Dusty stated flatly from the back. Since the only vehicle in sight was the motorhome and attached SUV, Roland assumed they must have just arrived in it. "They've been away?" "Yeah, they're retired and they travel the country almost year-round." He tried to remember her age from her chart. 26? Like she could read his mind, or maybe like she'd dealt with these questions all her life, she said, "I have 2 older brothers. I was an oops that my parents most definitely weren't expecting and didn't really want." She said it so matter-of-factly, like she really believed it, that Roland was honestly taken aback. His parents weren't the most nurturing people in the world, but he'd never doubted that he'd been wanted. He glanced in the rearview mirror to see her face, as his heart hurt for her. Maybe this was why she worked so hard to be the best in a sport that wasn't known for its women competitors. He pulled up beside the RV. "I know you can get out by yourself," he started. Her door latch clicking interrupted him. The gentleman in him couldn't let her do it herself. He got out in a hurry. No question, it was awkward, with her back brace and her knee brace, and her shoulder stabilized in a sling. "I can't believe your doctor even lets you out of the house. You're basically a walking medical supply store." "Funny." She avoided his eyes. "You're not supposed to be out of the house, are you?" he asked suspiciously, realizing belatedly he should have phrased it as a statement. "Only for therapy." She hooked a hand over the open door, standing with most of her weight on one foot. "I couldn't stand being cooped up inside all the time." She lifted a shoulder again. "Even when I wasn't racing, Kelly and Cassidy both spent a lot of time helping kids in the area. And Harris has the library, of course, and I was helping one of them constantly on my downtime. But now—" Her fingers tightened, and her eyes closed in frustration. "I'm more helpless than the kids they're working with. I'm pretty much useless." His hand ached to touch her cheek. He nodded instead. "Yeah, I know. It'd be hard to go from what you were doing to doing nothing." "Exactly. And when I sit around, all I think about is the stuff I could be doing and the stuff I want to do, and I can't do any of it." He almost said she should have her friends over, but he'd just seen her friends, and they all had babies and small children. They'd be busy, and Dusty shouldn't be jostled by toddlers and little kids anyway. "Now that your parents are home, they'll keep you busy." "They'll be leaving," she said flatly, her expression blank. It was too much for Roland, and his mouth shot out words faster than his teeth could catch them. "Then I'll come by. I'm not busy tomorrow, and I work early mornings, so I can be here at 3 o'clock every day. We'll find something to do that won't get you in trouble." He wasn't skirting the line between therapist and patient any longer. He'd just busted right through it. It was worth it to see how Dusty's face brightened. But she said, "You don't have to." "I know. I want to." Her blue eyes shifted to his, and they stared at each other. Hers wide and uncertain, the most vulnerable he'd seen her. Who knows what she saw on his face? Hopefully the swirling in his chest, that he couldn't even decide what it meant, didn't show up there. As he looked deeper into her eyes, he had to admit to himself that his feelings really did go beyond the surface therapist-patient relationship. That thought made him jerk back and look away. He couldn't do that. Not only could he not risk his heart with a woman who raced dirt bikes for fun, but he couldn't risk his job by getting involved with a patient. Just 2 months ago, his friend and the only other male physical therapist had been fired for getting involved with a patient. Roland knew, with his position as taking on the tough cases and also his high-profile clients, that he might be too valuable to get fired, but he didn't want to risk his job. For getting clients in physical therapy, reputation was everything. Plus, he needed to remember Janice. She was a daredevil too, although she didn't race. A little voice in his head reminded him of Dusty's chart. She wouldn't be racing dirt bikes ever again. He might not lose her like he lost Janice, who loved the speed and thrill of flying. What was wrong with him that he was attracted to daredevil females? Wait, did he just admit he was attracted to Dusty? "I want to help." He heard the words come out of his mouth. She nodded. "Okay, I'd like for you to help me." She looked a little surprised that she said that. He almost laughed at her open mouth and widening eyes. At least he wasn't the only one whose mouth seemed to be running off and leaving the thinking part of their brain far behind. Her mouth quirked up in a small smile, and his followed. The air between them seemed to swirl, like something fundamental shifted in their relationship. The spell was broken by a woman's voice calling, "Dusty, honey, is that you?" Chapter 7. Dusty turned, her shaking hand having nothing to do with the pain that throbbed in her back and foot, and everything to do with the man standing in front of her. What was that syndrome called? Rescuer syndrome or something? Where one fell in love with one's doctor or nurse or, in her case, therapist. Great. On top of all her physical problems, now she had mental issues. Just wonderful. "Hi, Mom." She pasted a smile on her face. Her mom loved her, she was sure of it. But when Dusty was growing up, she didn't really want to be bothered with her, and it was hard to get over that. "Where's Dad?" "Oh, you know him." Her mom waved her hand. "He has sports on already. We've only been home for 5 minutes. Her dad had been a top producer at one of the big sports channels. He'd never been on the air, but he'd lived, breathed, and slept with sports. NASCAR had been his favorite. She had to hand it to her parents. Doing the dirt bike circuit when she'd been little hadn't been cheap. They'd never complained one time about the money. "Come, give me a hug, honey." Her mom wiggled her eyebrows. "And introduce me to your boyfriend." She stopped with her hands on Dusty's shoulders. "You never told me you had a boyfriend." She shot Roland an apologetic look. "He's not my boyfriend," she said, patting her mom on the back and ignoring the ache in her back at her mom's pressure before letting go. "He's my therapist." "Oh," her mom's voice lowered. "He's a shrink?" Then he'd really be in touch with his feminine side. "No, my physical therapist." Her mom's brows lowered. "Should he be here? Is that appropriate?" Her eyes flew to Roland's. Her mom might have been a little put out, raising a child when she wanted to enjoy her late middle age, but she was still very influential in the community, and if she thought there was anything inappropriate going on, Roland could suffer. She didn't want him to lose his job over her, with her mom thinking he was here for a social visit. Could she just admit the truth? That Roland had offered her a ride? With only a second to make a decision, she decided not to risk it. "The doctor said I wasn't supposed to go out, so he's coming here." All technically true. Her mom looked at the car and the door that was still open. Her brows lowered. I don't remember seeing that when we pulled in. No, Dusty drew the word out. We were practicing getting in and out. She caught Roland's horrified expression over her mom's shoulder. And once I was able to get in, I hadn't been out in such a long time, I convinced him to give me a ride. Well, I do know it gets hard when one has to sit around at home. After I had each of my babies, I got so sick and tired of being home, and that was just a week. She smiled, and Dusty breathed a silent sigh of relief. Roland was off the hook. Mom, this is Roland Bryant. Roland, this is my mom, Joanne. Dusty shut the car door. I guess we're done with our session? Yes, I'm finished. Roland gave her a look that said he'd be talking to her later. Do you feel comfortable getting someone to take you to therapy on Monday, or should I come here in the afternoon? He asked that for the benefit of her mother, probably. But Dusty hadn't realized that she had a choice. You can just come here, Roland, her mother answered for her. Dusty always tries to do too much, and I don't want her out before the doctor gives his okay. Dusty shifted, trying to ease the pain in her back. I have a doctor's appointment on Monday morning. I should know after that if I'm allowed out. Roland narrowed his eyes at her, concern clouding his face. He'd noticed her discomfort, but he didn't say anything, just nodded. Then, so her mom would know that there really hadn't been anything inappropriate going on, Dusty fished her phone out of her back pocket, glad she'd worn jeans to the shower because of her braces. She clicked it on. Here, how about you put your number in my phone? I'll call you after my appointment and let you know what the doctor says. Roland took her phone. He looked at it while he spoke to her. I'll be updated over the computer system, but I'll give you my number anyway, just so you can let me know how you're doing and if you're feeling up to coming into therapy after going to the appointment. It seemed like he typed a lot longer than he needed to just to put his number in, but Dusty didn't really think about it. She shoved it back in her pocket. Thanks, Roland. I'll see you Monday. He gave a small wave. Monday. An hour later, as she was polishing her aluminum bike spokes, Dusty's phone buzzed with a text from Cassidy, wanting to make sure she got home okay. When she went to answer it, she saw what had taken Roland so long to put his number in. He'd typed out a message to her. This is the most ingenious way any woman has ever gotten my number. Dusty grinned. She supposed what she'd done could have been considered hitting on Roland, although she certainly hadn't meant it that way. Had she? He was attractive, no doubt, with a great personality. He also had compassion and a sense of humor. Any girl would be interested in him, so it wasn't unusual that she had a bit of interest in the guy. She rolled her eyes as she rubbed her polishing rag over her bike wheels. She was so full of it. There was no doubt she was attracted to him, and she thought he might feel something too. But he was her therapist. Not to mention she couldn't have a life if she were going after the championship. Some goals left no time for a personal life. Even as she thought this, her mind was trying to finagle a way to spend more time with him. Monday morning, Roland had a spring in his step, and his lips kept quirking up. Yesterday had been a long day of doing outside chores around his house, but today he'd see Dusty. He didn't examine his excitement too closely. Of course he liked her. Maybe there was a little attraction there, but he wasn't going to act on it. The morning flew by. I think that Mrs. Stinley has a thing for you. Abigail, one of the other physical therapists, grabbed her salad out of the fridge in the break room. She's like 80. Roland threw his lunch in the microwave and punched some buttons. He really hated it when his coworkers teased him about women crushing on him. since he tried so hard to be professional at all times, even if the woman in question was elderly.
"She's not dead."
He shrugged, grabbing a water from the fridge. There were usually 4 therapists on duty and several nurses and office workers. Most of them did errands over lunch and ate out. Roland had a deal worked out with scheduling where he could take a short lunch and leave early. It worked for him, since he needed about 5 minutes to eat, and that gave him time in the evenings to do what he wanted. Lately, he'd been able to schedule some private consultations. Eventually, someday, he wanted to open his own practice, focusing on training for injury prevention. There was definitely a market for it, and he'd worked hard for the reputation as the best in his current practice. But to be successful on his own, he needed an even bigger name. For what he wanted to do, it wasn't about saving money to get started. It was about building a reputation. He could be patient. As long as he kept working hard, it would come. The microwave beeped, and he grabbed his bowl. With his water and spoon in one hand, he started toward the door.
"You know, you could actually sit down and eat,"
Abigail said from where she sat at the table. She was new, having only been in the office for a few weeks. He gave her a smile to ease any sting in his words. "I'm sure you could do what I do, give up the lunch break and get out early." Actually, he was sure she could. Lunchtime was one of their busiest times of day. People wanted to schedule their therapy so they didn't miss work. Legally, the company couldn't make them work through their lunch, but they could volunteer. Abigail shrugged dismissively.
"They offered to let me do that when they hired me, but I can't go all day without eating, and I can't eat a salad in 5 minutes."
Roland jerked his head in acknowledgement and walked out of the lunchroom to the high desk, which was now deserted, that held the computers they used to type up their notes and get the doctor's information on patients. He'd been eager, too eager, all day to see how Dusty's appointment went. Punching in the password and pulling up the screen he wanted, Roland waited, chewing. Finally, the info he needed loaded, and he took another bite as he read through the notes. She'd not been given permission to lose the brace nor to drive. Basically, the doctor had noted that she was making progress, but was still in pain and needed to rest, other than therapy. Dusty had canceled her afternoon appointment. The doctor also had a note that the patient was doing at-home therapy with the same therapy group she'd been seeing. So, she was going to hold him to going to her house. One part of him was thrilled at that. The other part wished he'd never suggested it. They didn't need any special equipment, since, unless it was absolutely necessary, he always tried to plan a patient's program so they could do it at home without a big, expensive purchase. It wasn't that. He already had a hard time keeping her off his mind. Saturday, it had been too tempting to run his fingers through her hair and see if it was as soft as it looked, not to mention his odd desire to touch her, and not in a clinical way. He couldn't allow himself to cross that line, especially if he intended to start his own practice. Patients needed to be able to trust their therapist. As he finished his lunch, he ran down through his afternoon appointments. Nothing difficult. The hours dragged, and he was uncharacteristically distracted as he finished out his day. Normally, he loved helping people find ways to deal with the pain and get their range of motion and motor abilities back. Hard, but rewarding. He gave his last patient their instructions and made sure they had a ride before grabbing his things, saying farewell to his coworkers and heading out the back door. His phone buzzed just as he was stepping out. It wasn't a number he recognized, but he smiled as he read the message.
"When you can barely move, you have to get creative."
He actually laughed out loud as he clicked the fob in his hand. She'd gotten his message anyway. "What time do you want me?" He hit send before he got in and started the car.
"Come at 4. You can stay for dinner."
That was tempting. He'd really like to get to know Dusty outside of therapy. Normally, he'd feel like as long as they weren't actually doing therapy sessions, it would be okay for them to develop a friendship. He considered a lot of his clients friends. But with this attraction he felt, could he keep her at a friend's level? Everything in him wanted to try. Aside from the attraction he felt, Dusty was a nice person who could really use a friend right now. One who didn't have small children and a spouse demanding their time. To give himself some time to think, he typed, "What's on the menu?"
"I don't know. I'd have to ask the housekeeper."
Tempted to accept, Roland forced himself to type out, "Not today. Maybe some other time." He couldn't quite get himself to turn her down flat, because he really wanted to eat with her. But housekeeper? He grunted. Maybe because she raced motocross, or maybe because she was just so unpretentious. But it had really surprised him to find that Dusty's family was so wealthy. He wasn't exactly slouching in his current job, and he had plans to go even bigger. But they had a wealth he definitely wasn't used to. Who had a housekeeper? Dusty, apparently. Were her parents still home? He supposed he'd find out at 4. That was another thing he'd found really hard to believe. How could a parent, a mother especially, have her daughter go through all this therapy by herself and not feel the need to be with her, helping? It'd be one thing if she had a job and couldn't, but to leave her child alone so she could travel in her RV? No wonder Dusty was so determined to excel in a dangerous, male-dominated sport. He rang her bell right at 4, after a short debate with himself about whether to go to the front door or the back door. When he'd been there Friday, they'd disappeared around the back of the house, so he assumed the family used the back door. He'd settled on the front door. He'd like to be friends with Dusty, but he was there in a professional capacity, so that's how he was going to play it. The RV was no longer in the drive, but maybe it was out for maintenance? He could hardly believe that her parents would have left again already. Dusty was a grown adult, but still. A woman in shorts and a t-shirt, with a bandana tied around her hair and her eyes smiling, answered the door, holding it open but not inviting him in.
"Hello."
"I'm Roland Bryant, the therapist." The woman stepped back.
"Dusty said it was probably you. Come on in."
She closed the door behind him.
"Follow me."
He managed to keep his mouth closed as he looked around at the immaculate tile floors and soaring ceilings. The house was bigger than it looked from the outside, and he wasn't entirely sure he could find his way out as the housekeeper took him back a short hall and down some steps. Dusty waited at the bottom.
"Thanks, Blanche."
Blanche stood aside and waited for him to pass before heading back up the steps.
"I would have answered the door myself, but—"
Dusty shrugged, indicating her braced leg. "It's fine," he said. Her blonde hair was pulled back in its typical ponytail and hung over her shoulder down past her stomach. He shoved back the urge to see it down. She wore yoga pants and a t-shirt. He saw outfits like that 1,000 times a day, and his heart never did the strange thumping it was doing in his chest now. If she had makeup on, he couldn't tell. She looked fresh and happy, and so beautiful she made his eyes hurt, especially when she turned the wattage of her smile directly on to him. He figured he could safely assume that the doctor hadn't told her she'd never race again. Your parents have left again? He asked, breaking the silence. She blinked, looking away, and he wished he hadn't asked.
There's a race in Kansas.
NASCAR?
Yep.
I thought the races were on Sundays. He didn't follow motorsports at all, but he did watch sports channels and knew a little.
Dad likes to get a good spot.
She shrugged.
There are a bunch of people who have RVs and follow the races. They all know each other and they hang out together.
Her parents had left her to go hang out with their friends. Anger flared in his chest. He reminded himself she wasn't a child. He supposed she was lucky they let her live with them, which maybe was why the next question tumbled off his tongue without thought. Do you do anything? I mean, besides race? She gave him an assessing glance, like she was trying to figure out why he asked.
I have a graphic design degree. I pick up freelance work on the internet.
She gave a humorless laugh.
I've been doing a lot of it lately.
I see. She moved into the room and spread her hand around. A wet bar lined one wall. There was a treadmill and a few other exercise-type pieces of equipment grouped along the far wall. A cluster of couches and recliners circled a gas fireplace, and a big-screen TV hung on the wall above it. A few magazines lay on the coffee table. The walls gleamed white, and even though it was a basement area, it felt spacious and open.
Where do you want to work?
If he didn't know better, he'd almost say she was nervous. She twisted her fingers and didn't meet his eyes again. Was he having that effect on her? Maybe she was worried about what he'd think of her home. He couldn't think of another reason for her to be shifting her feet and twining the ends of her ponytail. Is everything okay? He asked, unable to ignore the fact that there might be something wrong. Her head jerked and her eyes widened.
Yeah. Yes.
She laughed.
Okay, I'm sorry. It just feels a little weird having you in my home, doing this here.
He smiled. He wasn't sure, but he thought that meant it actually was him that was making her nervous. Well, let's just get started then, okay? Take your brace off and we'll go to the steps first. He set his briefcase down on the counter and pulled out her chart. One of the benefits of working in the center was the computer access. He had the internet. That was it. You'll have to tell the doctor that you're seeing me personally, if that's what you want. He looked over his shoulder. Our office doesn't actually do outpatient, but I'm set up with my own business and license. The doctor just has to know and approve, and you'll have to notify your insurance. He had done this a few times with different patients. Not very often. Technically, there was a clause in his contract to the effect that he wouldn't steal clients from the practice, but they'd allowed him to give home therapy sessions to already participating clients if coming to the center was too much for them. Eventually, Roland knew the center he worked for wanted to add home visits, but they didn't have the structure in place to do so as of yet. She nodded as she set her bulky knee brace aside. She still didn't seem completely comfortable, so he figured it was his job to make things normal. Ready? Let's get to work. She stood. He gave her his elbow and a dark look when she acted like she wasn't going to take it. Did you recover from Saturday? Still sore? How's your back? He fired the questions off in his most professional tone. Maybe they were both attracted to each other. Whatever kinds of complicated things that made their relationship, he wasn't going to let it get in the way of giving her the best therapy he could. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.